Hello, this is Silas here, and I'm here with Steven. You can say what's up to everyone.
Hello, everyone.
We're here for our conversation series, and we're reading or talking about the book Cracks in the Ivory Tower, The Moral Mess of Higher Education by Jason Brennan and Philip Magnus. Steven, can you tell us a bit about this book and why we're doing this conversation series?
Sure. So this book has been exploring the various ethical issues in our higher education system, that is the universities. It's not talking so much about the ideology that's being taught, but it's more focusing on issues as far as incentives, as far as the way the money is being spent, as far as the quality or lack thereof of education people are getting. It's talking about why things are overpriced, why there aren't jobs available to all these graduates, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And it's focusing on higher education in the United States of America, which is about 9,500 schools that give degrees of different sorts, both undergraduate and postgraduate ones. But some of the importance of this is, as we're recording this, that's November 12th of 2020. A lot of eyes are on the United States of America due to a political issue going on there. And that is a similar thing that happens with the actual education system. A lot of countries look at the United States of America and say, oh, we wouldn't mind having the wealth and success and things that that country has. And they think part of it must be the educational system. A lot of countries have people who send their kids there, especially the elites or the people who go and study there and then they go back and hold positions of influence and politics and things like that in other countries. So if they have some idea of this being something to do, they go and actually start doing that in the other countries as well, or whatever is being learned besides the actual education itself. There's other things with the culture and the way to look at the world. The schools in the United States of America are a primary source of that globally. They inform a lot of how the world works. Now, other systems that we've talked about, things like the student debt, which we talked about in the separate where it was like 93% of it is publicly held and it's in the trillions of dollars.
Yeah.
But now you have a lot of other countries going into that and adopting that. One simple example is for us here in Kenya, where I'm recording this from, people normally do people normally do this Harambe type of thing where they come together and raise money to send someone to school. So they raise the money ahead of time and pay the school fees. Sometimes somebody has to drop out because there's not enough money. But they're starting to install a student loan type of situation where there's government-backed loans to get people into schools, but then that also government-backed, government incentivized debt in another sense than just government-backed loans when you look at it in that sense. Because are these people going to actually have the jobs? Are they actually going to have the results after? Or are we also just inviting that in the rest of the world? So those are some of the things that I'm proposing to make a case of why, especially at a time like this, when the world is going through a global pandemic, there's been a lot of pause on certain systems that might have been going more off of momentum than it actually being the way it is. And we've had the time to really rethink things in a way that I don't think has occurred in known history. Maybe after the world wars, when institutions were physically actually broken down and people were restarting things. But now we have a situation where idea-wise, things have been paused. And then now we're saying, okay, what can we start again? What can we actually reconstruct? What can we add that's new? What should we stop completely? So those are things that I think are happening. So it's a good a time as any to look at this and say, okay, how are we going to go forward with this? Any other thoughts?
Nope, that's it.
Okay. So with this series, as we've done in the previous series, we talk about different topics and different things. When we go to these trends with the book, Stephen has been reading this book. I haven't read the book. He kind of leads us through it with some quotes and some ideas, and then I kind of gives my thoughts back. And we've broken it up into the chapters, and there's 11 chapters, and we have a separate video with the seven, again, I keep forgetting the actual term of this. Do you know the term offhand?
Wait, sorry, what was the
term? 7 business questions. No, what was it? The seven big economic insights, and the normative ethics questions, and the descriptive business ethics questions. You kind of memorize this by now. We've got one more chapter to go. But I suggest if you haven't seen at least that video, that would help to watch before this one. The rest of the series, I think you can get the chapters in any order, or you should listen to this one after, because that's the lens that the authors actually are focusing on these topics about. And they also, they inform how we talk about the topics and how we look at this. And these are also questions that you can ask about the world in general. And that's why we're saying this is more than just about the schools. But even though most of us have been somehow involved in some kind of educational system, if not the outright schooling system, if you are listening to this, there's a high chance you have been into some kind of schooling system, just from the selection of the demographics that get discounted. Okay, yes. So let me read you the titles of the chapters. Number 1, neither gremlins nor poltergeists. Number 2, what the academics really want. Number 3, why most academic advertising is moral bullshit. Number 4, on reading entrails and student evaluations. Number 5, grades, communication breakdown. Number 6, when moral language is a cover for self-interest. Number 7, the general education hustle. Number 8, why universities produce too many PhDs. Number 9, cheaters everywhere. Number 10, 3 big myths about what's plaguing higher education. And number 11, answering the taxpayers. And that's it. And we mentioned that other one. So Stephen, so you can lead us in with number 10, 3 big myths about what's plaguing higher education.
Sure. All right. So over these last few chapters, we've talked about issues in the education system, and notice we haven't had to invoke gremlins or poltergeists. There's no nefarious spirits wailing through the system, or there's no little, monster sabotaging thing. It has to do with the incentives and the way people behave according to those incentives. So the 3 incentives we often hear blamed are, number 1, the corporatization of higher education, 2, neoliberal ideology, and 3, the threat of impending technological disruption. So the chapter will deal with how all these claims are really exaggerated. I mean, there are kernels of truth in each one, which I'll get into, but overall, the fear that's come with them is overblown.
Can you go over those again?
Sure. So it's number 1 is the corporatization of higher education. Okay. Number 2 is neoliberal ideology.
Okay.
And then number 3 is the threat of impending technological disruption.
Okay.
Sure. All right. So myth number 1. So this criticism is that academia suffers from the same cost-benefit, profit and results-driven mindset of the business world. We obviously don't object to that, but let's hear what they have to say. So there's been a lot of literature on this explaining that administrators devalue education for the sake of quote unquote the market. They blame universities on things like too many campus amenities and too much administrative growth. We talked in a previous chapter about how much more administration there is than in the past. And campus amenities, they criticize things like restaurants and different departments that don't deal directly with education. Sports as well. Again, we can get into the merits of that, but so
yeah, like how many people have their favorite memories about college being something with to do with sports or the cafeteria rather than the actual school.
Yeah. So to be fair, there is some truth to this. As I say, we talked in the previous chapters about the administration and also the rent seeking, how different groups lobby for special funding and interest. That money gets taken from everyone else to them. There's that what economists call the concentrated benefits dispersed costs. Again, like the rock climbing example, which I like to bring up a lot, you add $6 to every student's tuition. Yeah, it's not much money, but then if 100 or more groups all do that and each group adds on $100 or more to each student's tuition, you keep adding that up. Well, that's why you're paying thousands of dollars for things that you don't benefit from. And of course, there's also the issue of the advertising about what do they promise and what do they deliver. We talked about that before too. Well, so now where this whole claim is faulty is that there isn't that unlike a typical business, there's no clear profit mechanism or attempt to address budgetary bloat. So again, we bring up what we always say about profit. We profit all the time. This idea that profit's a bad thing is just stupid. I mean, how you spend your time is profiting. What you decide to buy at the grocery store, what you decide to do with your spare time, hobby-wise, all those things are profit. You get more value out than what you're putting into them. So the idea that profit is a bad thing, I think that's something that just has to be overturned. But also, to sort of follow up with this, again, this doesn't operate in the same way a traditional business does. In fact, this operates more like a government agency than a corporation. And universities sell quote unquote education in the form of the credentials and skills, but this isn't a traditional product the way a corporation sells a product. So did you have any thoughts before I read off what they...
Yeah, I was just thinking, again, it goes into problems that are not because of how we define X, but what X is. And also the Ayn Rand quote, where it's like, if you have a proposition, like, no, there are no contradictions. If you think you're facing contradiction, check your premises and you'll find one or more of them is wrong.
Yes.
So this one is you're thinking, okay, these are. Some people also say it's like not for profit thing, or they say these things are being done for this corporatization of the thing, but it's not a corporate entity. So I think with this one, depending on how you define the thing, you're going to have a problem with what you think those things are for. Because if you think it's just about academics, it's just about sharing information in the best way possible, then it doesn't make sense why they would spend $10 million in expanding the cafeteria so you can have like shrimp and fajita nights like 3 times a week instead of like once a month. You wonder like what is that? Like what does that have to do with somebody learning physics?
Yeah.
It doesn't. That's the key thing about it. But the schools are not their primary purpose is not solely to impart information onto the students, but it's to employ people, it's to grow the size, it's to get donations, it's to support sports teams, to support other institutions that are dealing with it. And when you have these kind of other amenities, your main, at least the main selling point, some of the fuel to that machine is students. So you have to get enough students who want to pick your school rather than the school down the road that is pretty much teaching the English degree, the English major that the person actually wants to have is pretty much exactly the same, whether they go to their community college or they travel across the country to go to a new college there. So you have to sell them on the school environment and the foods that they'll eat and how awesome this place is and the Instagram pictures they can take of their cafeteria. All those are the things that you have to attract students with. So on that sense, those purchases that they're making to expand the gyms and the cafeterias and get a game room in the dorms, that's why that's being done. So there's actually some kind of purpose of why they're doing it. It's just you're misjudging that it's an institution based on just education.
Yeah. All right. So James Buchanan, who we've talked about, he's basically the founder of public choice theory, and Nikos Devletoglu, I'm not sure how to say it. It looks almost like a Romanian name or something. They talked about the breakdown that occurs in 3 areas of the university. So number 1 is the consumers of education are not the direct buyers of their product. They get indirect funding through scholarships, public aid, subsidies, and sometimes parents. This gives students less incentive to shop around and get the best bang for the buck. So, of course, you can figure that out. If you're buying like a computer or something with your own money, it's money that you earned or inherited or whatever. So you're going to be very conscious about where does that go? Can I get the best deal for what I'm spending? Whereas with this, it's because they're not paying for it directly. It's, oh, well, I'll take out a loan for $50,000 a year or $60,000. Oh, well, I'll pay it off. It's not as big of a deal. So there is less of that incentive to shop around. The main producers of education, the faculty, are not the sellers of their products. They rely on administration to do that. So as we've been discussing, the incentives of students, faculty, and administration don't always align. So again, it's like you buy a product from a corporation like Coca-Cola or something. They have salespeople that they train, that they talk to stores and other people that they get them to buy their product, then they sell it at a markup. So it's the people are selling the products that they're producing directly, so their interests are tied together. Whereas here, it's the administrators have to entice students to go there for some of the reasons, like you said, like maybe it's an appealing campus, maybe there's a lot of amenities, maybe there's a sports team, but then it's the professors themselves are delivering the product. So there's sort of that disconnect. And then lastly, the third point is that the ownership of almost any university is usually several layers removed from administration and faculty. Public universities are technically owned by the state and managed by an appointed board of governors. Private institutions are usually set up under a board of trustees. These tend to be people with a background in philanthropy and politics, so they often defer to the administration themselves. So again, it's not like, okay, in a restaurant where it's like, I'm assistant manager, I answer to the general manager, he answers to the owner. There's a clear chain of command. The owner's not there all the time, but they're regularly in touch and they come in enough, they know what things are going on. Whereas here, people get elected to these board of trustees or board of governors, but it's people who are usually either retired or later in life who aren't going to be active in the day-to-day affairs. So there's sort of that disconnect.
Yeah.
So consumers don't directly pay for education, producers don't directly sell education, and owners don't directly run their institutions that provide education. So this reduces the responses to deal with cost, demand, and operational efficiency within the university system. In short, universities lack the basic signals that would cause them to run like a corporation. So as much as we complain about for-profit universities, these are hardly profit maximizers, even if they wanted to be so. And universities have many of the same problems that government agencies have. That's budgetary misallocation and waste, growing or bloated administrative staffs, redundant functions, inefficiency, and poor customer service. So again, universities are budget maximizers, not profit maximizers. And again, there are for-profit universities. They have their own problems as well, some of which relate to what we're talking about. This book didn't explore that super in depth, but they have a lot of the same issues with administrative costs, not delivering what's promised, all of that. And so when we talk about the corporatization, they do have some valid complaints, but it's a misdiagnosis. Corporations themselves do have some of these problems as well as far as inefficiency, but like the authors say, we can say universities function more like the DMV than like Disney or McDonald's. And at one of Phil's previous universities, a new sustainability office was created. It doled out $100,000 per year to faculty and students who did environmentally themed projects. Similar to the rock climbing example, only a few people benefit from something like this. Few may even want it in the first place, and everyone pays for it. So not only did it become an entrenched bureaucracy, but it also lobbied for more funding. This also happens with the traditional and long-standing offices, like the office that handles campus recreational activities. Phil saw how this used to be at a place he taught. It was one person, but then it became a team of 3 people. Then they created a council of students for internal governance and imposed new paperwork and dues. So they started charging people to participate. And they may, of course, believe they were doing the right thing. As we talked about, the elephant in the brain, this isn't done out of malice, but everyone ultimately pays, and then who benefits? And the bottom line is that the corporatization claim does have some merit to it as far as what it's discussing, but it misdiagnoses the causes, and it doesn't provide an accurate comparison of universities to corporations. Any thoughts or comments before?
Yeah, just in general, we look at the financial acumen of the students, teachers, and parents, who are, I think, the primary people when you talk about the education part of the school. And how much, on average, does your average 18-year-old understand about debt and about payments and things like this? Like if you asked your average 18-year-old, if you asked your average parent at that time, there's a lot of people who know me. I guess you know me in your 40s. I guess by that time you probably are doing a bit better. But then if you're in a position where, from whatever struggles you have in your life, you haven't been able to be in a position to actually had saved enough money for your actual college, for your kid to go to college, or taught them enough about the economics of the issue for them to understand, oh, I shouldn't have to go to this one school unless I get like some private scholarship or things. That's kind of thing. So I'm wondering, the people involved, then of course the teachers themselves, they're just being told, oh, you just come here and teach. Like they have their own personal interests about getting enough salary for them, but they don't really understand how the schools are ran and what actually takes to actually do that. I think they understand enough to understand there's some state involvement in the number of kids that can come to the school, and then that gives them more people to ostensibly defend them having a job. But the fact that with these shutdowns, with people just now being able to still access the information part of it, schools are still charging full tuition, should be something that shows people that that tuition is not strictly just to pay the teachers. It's not even primarily to pay the teachers to teach the kids. That's like, if you looked at the breakdown, I'd say maybe 15% or something like that would be to cover, or your tuition actually covers is money that you can say this directly came from tuition checks, and every year, whichever amount of tuition we get in, that's money from there. It goes directly to pay student teacher salaries. A lot of these other things are, as you mentioned, they build that rock climbing wall. That rock climbing wall, when you build it, it says it's going to cost $10 million or whatever. That $10 million isn't paid up front. It's paid on credit. It's paid on debt, and then it's prorated. Is that no? Prorated is something else. It's spread over the next 20 years to pay that wall back.
Yeah.
So they've checked in. They say, okay, on average, we're going to have like 5,000 students coming in every semester. We know the government has guaranteed to be having this program that's going to be bringing that in, so we can spread this cost up all the way across the board. And they do that across the board with a lot of other things, with contracts and with the what's it called, the welfare? It's not welfare. The Social Security or the retirement packages for certain people. They know they have certain teachers on tenure, so they know we have to pay this person for this. Oh, we're doing this research project. Oh, we have this football coach that's coming in. So you have these things, or the stadiums, it's going to run this much for the electricity for those massive stadiums with lights and things like this. So they have all those bills that are being paid, that they know these are things that have to be paid, whether or not there's a student on the actual campus. Since we have the campus, just the cost of running the campus is something that has lasted a long time. So that's already put into the cost of tuition. So that's why I think some people are kind of shocked, because, and this is something that I've talked to Stephen multiple times, is I'm becoming actually more positive when I see things are out of ignorance and people understand what's going on and still do the things. It's because people really thought that all we're doing is paying teachers. So like we pay for all this stuff as it goes, or a la carte in some kind of sense. Maybe they had that in mind. So they were thinking that now that we're not actually using all these other things, now that we're not actually using the room board, that means that we don't have to pay for it. It's like, no. Like that stuff, like once you signed up for the college, you signed a kind of contract to also pay for that for the entire time. Just like the university can't say, like, oh, you signed up as a freshman and you had the rock wall. Yeah, sophomore year, we're going to take that rock wall down. You've kind of signed up to have ostensibly some access to that rock wall as well for that 4 years. So that's kind of, I think, a relationship that's in there. And people also want the degree, not the ability. Yeah. Otherwise, there would be some system to test on the worth of schools that's not just, oh, these people have this many people graduating. The key thing about schools it wouldn't be the number of degrees they give, the types of degrees they give, the number of students that graduate, how happy students are. If it was truly about the information, then you would be testing, there'd be different markers to test how a school is good. It'd be something like, look, we have this many people who have achieved this kind of things. We have this many people who are financially secure 10 years outside of school. That would be the figures that they're actually leading with, but you hardly see a university lead with that in their advertising, and you hardly see students. I don't know if you're out there and you were a student, do you remember asking your recruiter? Did your parents ask? Did you have a talk with your parents? Did you have somebody on campus while you're doing campus visits say, yeah, from our school, we have this many people? And there's some schools that do, some parts of schools, like Alabama football team, they say, like, look, we've placed this many people in the NFL. If you come here compared to there, you'll be this successful. Mm-hmm. That's not something that's done in most schools, if I think for most departments and most other things. And it's like, you enjoy it here. It'll be so much fun. You'll meet all these people and you'll have just diversity. And it's like, no, I don't want to know how many people from here learned the thing that I did that I want to learn better than in other places. So yeah, that's just my rant.
And I sort of went through it, but it's like, just think very carefully about how the prices of all these things are determined versus like in a university versus a corporation selling a product. Like McDonald's, you know, they're not maybe the best example of the free market with subsidies and corn syrup and all this, but like, okay, they have to figure out how much beef do we need? Which purveyors do we get that from? What is the price versus the quality we pay? How many workers do we need to produce that? People pay for the product directly. So it's like, you know, then it's okay, well, if we want to reach even more people, how much do we spend on advertising? Like there's more of that true price discovery. Whereas with this, as you know, we're going through, there's all these things distorting it. Like you don't get the money, you know, the money is not coming directly out of your pocket, at least not in the there and now. You know, you're not paying just for the things you want to learn and that's it. So there's all these things that distort it. And yeah, that's going to get a much different product, that like the DMV analogy, that versus like if you go to a company, buy something directly. Oh.
Yeah. I mean, the McDonald's one is a pretty good example because it's just a pretty fantastically ran institution. And it's surprising that it's a basic thing. People like to eat, people want to eat, and they do this across many nations. It's a simple thing. I want to come to this location and get these calories and not be hungry anymore. They figured out the product. They developed how to do it. They developed how to franchise it, how to take it around to different places and just alter the thing around. It's in many different countries. It's an international thing. When you go to McDonald's, it's still McDonald's. You might have some different little flavors here, some different little ingredients here, some different little like taste combinations in somewhere else. But you get the idea of it.
Yeah.
Why isn't there a similar thing in the educational system? Why can't Harvard somehow franchise what Harvard is doing and just have be like, we do it best. We do burgers, and here's the information that we're doing, and just get a way to encapsulate some kind of educational system. Like we can teach it this way, and then we can franchise it to different people. Why hasn't there been something in that industry that has developed that? Now, there could just be challenges. Maybe it's an entirely different sphere of, maybe it's an entirely different, I don't know what the right term to use here. maybe it's an entirely different market, it's an entirely different sector that can't be franchised in that way, can't be
Yeah.
brought down to a simple form that way. But then you look at the supply chain, you look at the delivery, you look at the maintenance, you look at the standards they maintain. Like those are all things that are there with McDonald's, with achieving that one product in such a diverse way, but that works in so many different ways. And one last thing, it's a good example. I just saw this list of restaurants that were closing. They're saying places are not going to be there anymore. And it's a common thing in the best of times with restaurants, very thin margins in most businesses, but restaurants in specific, and you have a background in that. I just kept scrolling down on this website and was like, just company after company after company. And I was like, okay, it is almost easier to put a list of companies that are doing okay after this time. And McDonald's wasn't on the list. Like Burger King was on there. There was a lot of other people on there, but McDonald's just has a system that's apparently even like pandemic proof, because they were the only really major name that wasn't on that list. All these other big names were just struggles. So, yeah.
Well, I mentioned that about McDonald's is probably not a free market, because I know some no true Scotsman libertarian is going to hear this and bite my head off and say, no, they get subsidies. There's Corona. I understand, but like that type of company in a free market would be what I'm describing. That they have to focus on, as I say, like getting the best beef for their product. It's not the best overall, but it's what are they willing to pay? And then, okay, the role is, do you make them themselves or outsource them? Like all those things, like there is the attention to detail for all those components. Whereas here, a lot of things get lost in the shuffle because of these incentives. That was my overall point. All right. So myth number 2 is the neoliberal takeover of universities. Now, neoliberalism, me personally, it's one of these terms. It's sort of like how capitalism is misused. It gets thrown around a lot. I don't really know why. I don't think it's ever clearly defined. So the origins can be traced back to the early 20th century. In the 1920s, the anti-capitalists, that is fascists and communists, both used this term to attack laissez-faire. The term came up again in the 1930s among followers of the American journalist Walt Lippmann, even though Lippmann himself never used the term. Lippmann sought to bring back liberalism as an alternative to socialism and fascism, and he was trying to dissuade people that liberalism was to blame for the Great Depression. That's a whole conversation in of itself, but many people took the 1920s as the excess of capitalism. The Great Depression was the punishment, but of course, we can get into is it the banking system and all these other issues on top of that. So Lippmann was more of that school of thought that no, that this is being misunderstood. We can't abandon free markets. We have to understand the government intervention caused this. So in Paris in 1938, this term was thrown around to describe the effort to do this, and it was trying to essentially reclaim the idea from the 1920s. This name never really stuck. It showed up in only a handful of publications from 1930 to 1950, but there was no clear association to Lippmann or any other cause. There was a term ordo-liberal in post-war Germany, which tried to blend ideas like deregulation, free trade, and other free market ideas with a welfare state, progressive taxation, and central banking. Neoliberalism was often associated with this school of thought. Now, the modern use of this term doesn't even connect much with this idea, as it caught on about the mid-'80s or so, drawing from a 1978, 1979 lectures from Michel Foucault. There he is again. We talked about him a lot in the last series. The term is never clearly defined. It seems to include both laissez-faire and robust welfare state, advocating some sort of third way between capitalism and socialism. This term has been applied to Milton Friedman, Ludwig von Mises, Alan Greenspan, Margaret Thatcher, Al Gore, Tony Blair, Ayn Rand, and even Augusto Pinochet. Also, sometimes it was even applied to Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in the last election. So it's sort of my own commentary. It's sort of like the term far right. Like people have used far right to mean anarcho-capitalist. Oh, you're anti-government. That's far right. They've used Tea Party people, limited government. Oh, that's far right. They've used fascist, totalitarianism. That's far right. So, it's one of these terms that's just sort of thrown around and applied to everything. It's not clear what it actually means or why. And what does it have on academia? Well, this is one of those poltergeists that gets blamed for problems in academia. So it's been used to attack market incentives as they relate to academia. So they criticize rugged individualism. There we go again. They talk about lack of social responsibility, lack of public values, not enough attention on the public good, issues with consumerism, market-driven paradigm, et cetera, et cetera. And it's it's sort of like we discussed with capitalism in the 1619 Project. Like they've applied it to a slave-based economy. They've applied it to mercantilism. They've applied it to the roughly laissez-faire economy of the 19th century. They've applied it to the cronyist economy of recent times. It gets applied to everything, and it's never really clearly defined. And the thing I always have emphasized too is that nobody self-identifies this way. Like nobody says I'm a neoliberal, I'm leading the neoliberal movement. No, that it's used as this pejorative to describe everything. So again, it's one of these things, like you question people, what does this actually mean? They can't give you a clear answer. Any thoughts or comments before move on?
Yeah, it's helicopter man over there. So it's yeah, and that's something that's going on right now with the current political issue. Is no matter how it turns out, there's going to be some parties that people might consider or call neoliberals, also throw anarchists in there. That's a weird thing. Like when they talk about, we're talking about the mixing up of some of these terms, like alt-right libertarians. Anarchism came from the libertarian side, yet somehow people on the left are the ones being called anarchists. But I guess you have like anarcho-communists, and I had a conversation with somebody, a separate part, where I have this talk with somebody who's a scientific Marxist, a scientific socialist, and they're talking about, they were trying to explain how anarcho-communism is a thing, and they couldn't really describe how you'd have that system without a state. So I still get that. But yeah, these some of these terms, and it goes back to the first chapter with the goblins and poltergeists, it's not helpful to talk about things in this way. Not just in the dismissive nature of it, but you're not describing when liberals. Like you can I guess you could be describing something, but if you do use these terms, try to actually go forward and try to define and confirm that the person you're talking to knows what you're talking about, because that could mean a wide swath of things. And then on top of that, the percent of the people that would actually fit that definition that you're talking about, I think you will find it's a loud minority. We've discussed in previous series, we'll probably discuss most definitely in this series as well, what happened at Evergreen State with Brett Weinstein and Heather Heyer. And there's a documentary that covers it in an excellent way. It's one of the things that really brought some of these issues in education to the forefront, to the social, political landscape more. If you hadn't been watching these things like I had, like Stephen had, you might not have been aware of that until that came onto the board. And I think after that, it's kind of exploded, where I heard a lot of people speaking on this topic that didn't seem to be aware of how it actually was. There's certain things that I was like, oh yeah, I remember hearing about that back in 2015. Like, you're talking about it now. That's good. Good to know. That's a study from like 2005. Like, things have changed since then. So that's the kind of thing where I think you can look back if you've been in school, and there might have been some touches, there might have been some things here and there. But was it this boogeyman of neoliberalism? Is it something that's truly taking over the schools? Is it something that's truly embedded in changing things to a point, just because 95% of professors donated to the Democrats, does that mean neoliberalism and critical theory has taken over everything? I'm not quite sure. We could talk about that. And you see, I think that's a point, like saying like, okay, now critical theory, that's something that is identifiable, that we can talk about, that people can say, yes, I believe this, that, and the other. And it's something that has been studied, like we talked about in the critical theory discussion series. That's something that you can focus on and deal with point by point, and actually have something to counter in that sense, versus just that neoliberals kind of term that people throw out there.
Well, it's funny. I heard a socialist person that I used to know called de Blasio a neoliberal as well. And I'm trying to figure out like what was the angle here, because on the one hand, he supported the Sandinistas and railed against private property. But I mean, he's not giving all his money to charity. He's still living pretty well. And they talk about him devaluing New York property, but like it's like,
how is he mayor?
Are you but it's like, what are you criticizing? Are you criticizing that he's not socialist enough? Are you criticizing that he's using the government to enrich himself? Are you like, I don't know what that's attacking specifically.
Yeah.
I should have asked in retrospect,
but how is those people? It's strange. It's just trying to rethink and understand what are people in things for? Like, what do people go to school for? What do people expect out of school? Because some of the things I'm like, weren't you not in school? Why are you surprised of what happened after school? And I was that kind of person for some time. When I graduated, it was like, okay, I did the graphic design, I did the post. I did the post grad in animation, and I was thinking like, okay, I hadn't. I don't know why I thought I would be making the amount of money that I would be at that time. And for me, it helped break me out of that more because it was like, okay, I can kind of understand. I had very little knowledge about economics, financial economics at the time, the market and price and supply and demand and things like that. But I learned the stuff in the United States and Italy, and I did understand enough about the price conversion rate, about the currency conversion rate and things like that. And I also understood that it's a different kind of situation if you have people connected. I was wondering, okay, I do graphic design, I do websites. Why is it that a website in the United States of America is $1,000, but then in Kenya I can't even get somebody to pay me like $100 for it, the equivalent of $100 for it? I'm like, okay, because the person in the United States of America will create that website, and that website will be seen by like 10,000 people in a month and bring them in $100,000 in revenue. But the person in Kenya, if I create that same website for them, it'll be seen by 100 people over the next month and maybe bring in like $2,000 in revenue. So can they give me like half of what they're potentially going to make for making a website? It doesn't make sense in that sense. So something like that pushed me to get to that knowledge of knowing and defining what I'm talking about, and not just being like, okay, these are the things that I believe because of this. And that idea that I had, that I deserve more money in this, I see a lot of people having that similar idea because they haven't really been tested in that sense. And then someone will look at that person and say, that is a neoliberal thing, is why these kids are demanding more out of society. I'm like, not quite. Maybe you're misidentifying what the actual issue is with that child, with that kid. There could be something else in the system of the school not really being about, as we mentioned in the previous section, about achievements, but just about getting the degree. So they'll tell the kid whatever it needs to take, whether it's a neoliberal professor or not. It's not like conservative professors are like, well, maybe you should leave my class because you're not going to be able to earn. Conservative professors are also in that same cabal of them being like, hey, we're just doing a job. We're just here to give the information to the kid. So that's I think, if we identify some of the issues that we have and other people have with the school, and they say that's neoliberalist, there could be some positive things you're throwing out by tagging it that. There could be some negative things you're going to be unable to actually address by mistagging it this neoliberalism type of thing.
Yeah. So you sort of touched on the next point here. So what's strange is that academics, as we know, are notoriously left-leaning. According to a national survey in 2014, 60% of academics identify as left or far left, just over 10% identify as conservative or far right, and the rest are moderates. And the numbers have shifted over time, especially since 2000, with conservatives and moderates dropping numbers, while left-leaning individuals increased almost 20% over the same period. So before 2000, left liberals were more balanced with other groups. In 1984, a national faculty found that just about 34% of professors identify as conservative, which was about the national population. Again, today it's around 10%. Now, of course, they've debated how many are, but keep quiet. But I mean, it's definitely a drop. And the U.S. population politically represented has been pretty stable. Like, there isn't some, things will change with individual elections, but the overall population, most people are in the middle. Some are far left, some are far right. Then you have slightly bigger groups more on those edges, but not all the way. And then it's like, to that point, it's like, if the faculty is generally more left leaning, shouldn't quote unquote neoliberalism be disappearing? And some people have blamed this on the administration rather than the faculty, but the evidence suggests that the fact that the administration is left leaning too. According to a study done by the New York Times in 2018, 70% of administrators surveyed were liberal or very liberal, and only about 6% were conservative. So this means there's more of a leftward shift within administration itself. And so, again, this sort of goes to the point, and I think I might have mentioned this before about journalism, same thing. Like, we complain about biased media, and people say, like, oh, what's the proof of that? It's like, well, what is it? I think it's like 76% or so are registered Democrats. 90%, I think, identify as being on the left, according to Pew Research. And again, I've sort of changed. Like, I used to complain about bias. Now I see it as we're all biased, but it's like, if the main purveyors of information are all in one camp, you know how it's going to be slanted. Like if I read a book, The Truth About the Catholic Church, but it's written by a group of lifelong religious Catholics, I know what I'm going to be hearing in advance.
Yeah.
It's like, it doesn't mean it's all outright lies, but it's going to be slanted one way. And it's like, and then this gets into sort of the incestuous environment of, well, certain people get preferential treatment and promotion. Certain people will get hired for internships, others won't. People who dissent get maybe not kicked out, but they sort of get limited as far as their advancement. So, this whole thing just becomes self-reinforcing as well. So, yeah. Any comments on that particular point?
Yeah, with that one, it's again, it's just wondering where are the sources? Where is the actual issue with it? Do the people call themselves neoliberals, or are they just? What does that mean? Again, it's just with finding the definition of what it actually is and what does that actually portend, because somebody could be something personally, but does that actually somehow have an application in how they actually behave? Is there a neoliberalist way to be a dentist? Now, if we agree there's no real neoliberalist way to be a dentist, could there be something else about administrating a university that, yes, this person happens to be neoliberal, but that does not inform the choices they're making as an administrator of the place? Because I don't think anyone would, if you heard that, 95% of dentists donated to the Democratic Party, I don't think you'd suspect that there's something different happening in dentistry. like you wouldn't really find some kind of connection to that. Oh, now like more people need root canals, so it must be due to neoliberalism. I don't think you'd put the two and two together. There would be something else that you thought was responsible for that particular market change in that whole industry. So yeah, I think that's just something to keep in mind.
Well, it sort of relates to the whole thing about like, the socialism didn't work because it didn't have the right people running it. Well, according to this, they're being run by people who should be against so-called neoliberalism. So shouldn't that mean there should be less self-interest, less corporate greed, all that? But this is the same thing with socialism. Like all these people entering government say, oh yeah, we're going to take care of the poor, all this. They always end up wealthy. So it's like, and those are people that are supposedly committed to the ideas. So if the people who say they're the most committed to the ideas are doing this, what would happen if anyone else is in charge? Like, why would it be, it's like, how could this work? I mean, you might get that 1 in a million person, like there is, what was it, the president of Uruguay or Paraguay, one of those countries, who would come up wearing like a Hawaiian shirt or something to conferences because he was like very modest. Like you do get those occasional types, but that's one out of how many,
Yeah.
So, yeah. It's the same thing here. It's like, yeah, you may get someone who cares and puts their self-interest aside, but it's, how out of how many. And then just to sort of finish up here on this particular point. So another argument people try to make for this is that they say that neoliberalism prizes degrees that result in lucrative jobs in the private sector, and they devalue the social science. But as we talked about previously, the jobs in academia, particularly English, are growing at a faster rate than there are PhDs to absorb them. So when they say, oh, they're devaluing social sciences, they're devaluing English, well, no, the jobs are growing at a faster rate than the rest of academia, but there's still too many degree holders to fill there's too many. There aren't enough jobs to absorb all these degree holders. That's what I'm trying to say. And then they've tried to say, neoliberalism is happening from outside the university. But again, let's examine this further. What other factors would influence the rising costs? Well, loose money, Federal Reserve policy, government guaranteed loans. Of course, public universities would face cuts during things like recessions. Could it have to do with the public funding strategies? So how there's still public funding, but it's more indirect than it used to be. And it's worth examining all these different incentives rather than just blaming it on a poltergeist like neoliberalism. So I like the last sentence of this section. They go, neoliberalism is destroying academia is like Bigfoot, unsubstantiated, but a widely circulated myth.
Yeah. I think I don't really have much to add on that one. Yeah.
Sure. So then this last section here is pretty short. It's the coming technological disruption. That's myth number 3. So they blame the problems not on current issues, but things that may happen. So the internet has made information the most accessible it has ever been, and university lectures are now online for free. So it scares universities because they worry it's going to put a lot of them out of business, and then everyone's just going to be learning for free, and then people are going to stop going to universities. They're going to lose funding, and then it's going to be a mess as far as signaling and all of this. So the thing is, I sort of had mixed feelings in this section because I kind of get that angle, but the other side of it is that as things are currently, employers are still looking for credentials. I mean, it's becoming less and less so because as more people have bachelor's degrees, what do bachelor's degrees mean? But as I sort of said in a previous talk, it was sort of like that analogy with people standing up on a chair or whatever at a concert. Like, it benefits one or two people to do that, but then everyone does that while they're all standing at the same level. So then someone has to stand higher, then everyone stands higher. And like, at some point, this is unsustainable. It's like, I think what I said last time was something like, it's like it would get to the point if we keep continuing this, everyone's going to be standing on towers to view a concert that's on a stage in front of them. Like, it makes no sense. And how this is going to end, is it a bang or a whimper? It's hard to say. They're talking about a lot of these little lesser known universities are probably going to sort of fade away. The big name guys will always be there. I mean, Harvard will be around, Yale will be around, all that. But a lot of these lesser known colleges, I mean, they're just going to say, there's no point in funding these. Enrollment's going to drop. It's not worth taxing people. It's like, I think it's going to start at the bottom. Then hopefully some of the higher people, they're not going to disappear, but they're going to have to cut some unnecessary bloat and other things. And they've talked about how the credentials are still required. And a lot of things, like, for example, they compare two students who are both, these are fictitious, but just sort of to make the point. One is named Matthew, one is Melissa, and they're both interested in the French Revolution. And one decides to get a history degree specializing in it. The other gets an MBA. Now, only one could find a career in that. The other would have to go into business or something else. So Matthew, with his history degree, he can become a curator at the museum. Melissa is fascinated by it and knows a lot, but she can't work in that. She can only work in business and something else. As far as the way things are still structured that way. So the credential still does matter. Again, what is the longer term? They talk a bit about online courses, and they still have to compete with universities in terms of reputation. I will wonder if we'll get to a point where some of these other things become refined enough, like sort of like what we were discussing before with the alternative media, where it starts at a much lower level, but it gains enough of a following that eventually they can hire a bigger staff, they can hire a producer, and then they can compete with some of the bigger guys. So I'm wondering if some of these online and alternative education will sort of follow that same path. And, unless something radical changes, we're still going to be relying on this credentialism. Now, again, what's happening down the pike, I think there could be a lot of changes, but as things are, we still need these credentials for a lot of things. So any thoughts or comments on this section?
Yeah, one of the things that it belies the lie of free education is just check and see how many universities, these institutions, support the increase of free education. How many teachers and things like that are like, yeah, we need to support the political parties that are pushing free education for all, and all these kind of things. That term is just pernicious. There's the fact, if you think it's an institution that's about facts and accuracy, they would be the first ones to come and say, well, that term free is not quite right. You can say tuition free, things like that, but to just say free is a misnomer. It's kind of like the whole, we want to cancel the police, defund the police. Oh, we don't really mean that. We want to reimagine. It's like, no. Say what you mean. So we're talking about free here. It's not free because the teachers and these schools are supporting it, because if you have the government investing in free education, that means more money for the schools, more guaranteed money for the schools that they can plan for a longer time. It's not that whole situation where, like these alternative education places, I think they don't even have to compete to the size of these schools. In fact, my argument is these schools would not become the size that they were if it wasn't for government interference, government regulations, and propping them up. These are mutated beings. The way it would actually work is these people would develop, and you see these different business plans. And you mentioned, we'll talk about this more in the conclusion of this series, I mean, 2 videos from now. And we've mentioned different places like Praxis, these other places where they have other systems to actually educate the people. And since they have a different business plan, their system for actually getting profits is going to be different. They're going to cut out the overhead. Praxis doesn't need a climbing wall. They don't need to invest in the climbing wall. Praxis doesn't need a sports team and a stadium with massive lights that has, every time you have that stadium, you need people in the stadium because the lights actually cost. Actually, I need to double check and see with the changes now with people actually going in stadiums, at least when it comes to colleges, are there more games during the daytime? Because having a game at night, of course, you have the lights, and then the people in the stands will pay for some of those costs. But if you have them during the daytime, then you don't have to have the lights on. So there's things to consider if they want that. But anyway, so coming back to this thing, they have different kind of payment systems. So you don't have to have a system where you say, okay, we need to guarantee that we have 5,000 students a year coming into our school so we can get that $50,000 ahead to make sure we have all these costs. An alternative education place might have a yearly running cost of $250,000. So they might only need to have 3 or 4 actual students a year coming in to supply that amount and actually pay all their students, pay all their overheads, pay for the hosting costs and all these things, developing new products. The students are working on their own schedule. They're learning from home, so you don't need room and board. They have their own computer, so you don't need to supply them the computer and things like that. You're not running electricity bills for your things like this. The students are learning at their own time. And that's the kind of situation where I think you're going to start seeing more of that happening. And you don't necessarily have to have smaller things actually get to be competitive. It just needs to be enough of that. And I think that kind of system is something that you actually can franchise. And there's something that I had thought of back when I left teaching. I was thinking of doing it while I was still teaching, but then I left that, started developing it, thinking this might be a good time to bring it back up with those who can teach, and start off with this animation program I developed where I think it's a kind of simple thing, and there's examples of things out there where you can learn on your own. And I was thinking this could be a system that you can teach, you can give to businesses and other companies and institutions that might need animators to train or teach some people within their actual workspace, or people who want to learn and come and work for them, or just free agents and things like that, where they can have these systems where it's like, okay, you need this as a business. Instead of going to these arbitrary schools that you might not know that supposedly have taught someone to do it, you just advertise like you're advertising for a job, and you train them directly. You're already training people with things like this. So why don't you just handle and train them into the system that works exactly to what you actually need to do, versus that inverse of letting somebody else put 4 years of all these other things into their minds, general studies and all these other things into their minds, and have them have different expectations, versus getting somebody from the break who comes to you because they like your company, they like your product, they want to be in there. They're learning the system with your actual content. That's just a better way of doing these things that I think is definitely possible. With the tech shouldn't be a disruption. It's a tool to help us. It's not they tech our jobs. It's tech equals jobs. it should be that.
Well, one analogy I was going to make now is like they always talk about like the invention of the car disrupting all the horse and buggy things. But I thought an analogy here that might be a little more apt would be something like when Henry Ford got his assembly line production method going. That's sort of what some of these online things are doing to the current universities. It's the old way of making cars was very, it was long. It was tedious. That's why cars were basically horseless carriages for the rich. But he figured out, how do we produce them in such a way that the average person can afford them? And I think in the 20s, they said cars dropped by about 2/3 in price. So the average person could get them. And it's like, you could get a well-made car, like relative for the time, but it was well within your range. And I'm wondering if a similar thing is going to happen with the colleges, where it's, okay, we can find a way to streamline a lot of this stuff so you can still learn the material, you can get your money's worth, but then it's not worth doing it in this long, arduous, backwards way. And again, looking back now, you wouldn't say in the 20s, no, let's keep making cars the old way. It's sad that people aren't going to buy cars made the old-fashioned way. Like, you wouldn't see any practical reason to that.
Yeah, exactly. And there's some cars that are still going to need it. I'm trying to think, like the Lamborghini factory still has its own assembly line of sorts.
Yeah.
But it's going to take some more care and extras that create a different product. But why do you need that same exact system for? I don't know. I would throw some car names under some Hyundai or some Vauxhall or just some Prius, or maybe the Prius with electric. But okay, so whatever. It's just different places have different kinds of technology to actually build the thing. So you're not going to expect just an average Ford Taurus. Do they still make the Taurus?
I don't know.
But you don't really expect the Ford Taurus to go through the same system that a Lamborghini Murcielago would.
No.
So that's the kind of Murcielago, yeah. So that's the kind of thing where that demand will still be there. There's still things like they're doing a remake of Tim the Toolman Taylor, Home Improvement. I think they're bringing it back.
Oh,
but I remember with Home Improvement, he was a hobby car guy. He used to have a car in his garage, and he'd go there and work and build it. You can still do that. You can still build the Model T whichever cars were before the Model T by hand, and then find somebody who wants to buy it and sell it. So you'll still have certain institutions that have everything that we've said is not quite applicable for schools. We're saying it's not just garbage stuff. It's just the fact that they sell one product and they're actually about something else. So if you just advertise schools as what they are, like come hang out for 4 years, meet some people, maybe you'll learn some things on the side, you'll watch some football games, it's a break from actual life for some time, and then after that, maybe you'll be able in a position to get back into life with the connections and other things that you've done in that sense. There's still going to be an appeal for that.
Yeah.
so there's still going to be people who are willing to actually go ahead.
Sorry. Well, I was just thinking it's a cost benefit analysis thing too. Like it's like for a lot of people, a car is just a thing to get around. It's the same thing here. People want to learn skills they need to get into the workforce and work their way up, but they don't need all the bells and whistles just because. Like there are even people with money who don't get the nicest cars because they see it as like, it was sort of like, I think I made the analogy in a previous discussion about with food. Like there are even people who make good money. They don't eat out in nice places because they say like, this isn't worth it to me. I don't see the value. And it would be the same thing here. Like people who are passionate, who are talented, hardworking, who just want to learn enough to get in the door, it's like there's the market for them. Then if you want to go and pay for all those other bells and whistles, it's like I do wonder if some of these institutions would return sort of to what they were in the old days, where Harvard was like finishing school for the rich. Like it was like, oh, you're from this family, so you're going to go here and row on the crew team, and you have a Harvard degree, but it's like. Meanwhile, you have people like Rockefeller, Carnegie, all them who it's like, no, they just go out, work their way up. And then, yeah, they may send their kids there as like a status thing, but they're learning actual skills and working their way up accordingly.
And that's not necessarily a negative thing when you're finishing school for whatever group. I can see some kind of method of that happening. And as we talked about before, there's a lot of other things the school offers that could be done in another way. If you were advertising it in that sense and not adding that school part, there would be other ways to do it, where it's like you can do all those things and also have a job that pays you, instead of the inverse of you can do all those things and be paying these other people these things. But when it comes to the finishing school type of thing, you already have this kind of situation where universities have towns that grow up around them, where they're spread around the United States of America, and that's how it is in many places. I can imagine a thing where you still have those institutions, and it's the kind of thing where it's like now you have the businesses and other people that work and live in that area actually investing in running it. Instead of having the state, the federal government come in and pay money to these schools, have the local environments actually invest in them and be the employees of the place. And then you can have a situation where maybe if somebody's moving to the town, instead of like waiting for the house that they need to be built or waiting for the job to be ready, they move some time earlier and before they actually get into the town, get into their home, get into their business. They're on campus, kind of interacting with people, sort of finishing school to get to know the area you're moving to. Maybe you can have that kind of system where it's still there, where somebody, instead of signing up for 4 years semester, you have those same institutions are still there, but now instead of having people in those areas learn things from schools and that kind of system, be kind of isolated on that system, you say after people graduate high school, you sign up for 4 universities, I guess it would be called something else, but the campuses are still there. Then for a couple of semesters, you move around to different places and you live there, you have your room and board, and during that time, you're doing odd jobs in the community, in the society there. And it gets you more of an idea. Do I want to live in Alabama? Oh, I've spent a couple of semesters and on the Alabama campus working in Alabama, getting to know the people there before I just up and move from Washington to that place. And you find that you like it, but you try different places. So that could be different things to do where that system, the investment has been put towards having a location like that still has some positives, but to claim at this point, I think if you've been following us in this conversation, to really claim that you really think that is the best and only way we can actually educate people with the current technology and current abilities that we have today, I think is I don't know where you're coming from if you still actually believe that.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, like Zachary Slayback wrote in his book, The End of School, he was the former business director at Praxis. Like he said, he's like, you want some of these things. It's like you can get some friends together, you can rent a house, you can go to local sports games. Like you can make friends, you can have parties together. Like you don't have to abandon these aspects of life. I mean, you can still have those sorts of experiences, but it won't put you massively in debt. And then, as some people have put it, it's like you see to you school is more about those things, and then the price of that is, I have to go to class and pay attention once in a while, and then it's like you end up paying massively in debt. Whereas with this, it's more like, okay, you could learn things you want, develop skills you'd like, and then on your free time, then you can go to those parties and other things.
And that's something that's coming. So, and thanks for listening to this series. But we're telling you the future. This is stuff that's it's just a matter of time with some of these things. It's not. I can't see. I'm seeing the end of the road when it comes to a lot of the things that we were talking about, the institutionalized type of schooling that has been going on.
All right. That's all I have for this section. So any other thoughts? Or,
No, I think we've pretty much talked most of the things that, the content has gone well. Is there anything else I can think of? No, not so much. So it was, there's 3 different myths. So this is a question now to the people out there. Did you have these things as the primary causes, and do you think we actually broke this down? Do you think the authors broke it down in a good way, or do you think we were off on some of these things? Do you think the authors missed anything, or do you have any personal experiences with these things that woke you up where you're like, you thought this was actually an issue, then you actually realized, it's actually not that big of an issue? Or have one of these things specifically affected you in your life more so than they have with other people? Yeah,
it's good. All right.
Okay, so
sure.
I think that's it for me. Stephen, thank you for the conversation as usual. We're in the talks to actually get this going. Next series coming up is Human Action, and that one for me is it's going to be a doozy. It's going to be a good one, but I'm wondering how we're going to get with that. But with this one, we're almost at the end. I've already started posting the initial. I posted the initial part of this, and I have a schedule to post the rest. So most definitely by the time you watch this, everything else until up to this point will be up. I post them in order, but you don't have to watch them in order. As I mentioned, I suggest at the very least, listening to the 7 big economic insights and the normative business ethics questions and the descriptive business ethics questions before you continue listening to any more in this series.
Sure.
Yeah, that's it.
Cool.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.